The iPhone X, which will forever be known as the X, so don't be that one comment troll correcting everybody about it, is the most expensive and the most beautiful iPhone ever made. Since I took my sweet time making this review, I can probably safely assume that you already know all the basics about it that other reviewers have covered elsewhere. But if somehow this is your introduction to the X, I'm gonna cram a standard 10-minute YouTube review into the next 60 seconds. The glass front and back are very breakable and expensive to repair. It has the fastest benchmarks of any smartphone available. It's even faster than my 13-inch MacBook Pro at certain tasks. Face ID works the majority of the time. Sometimes it doesn't. Facial mapping data is stored on a secure part of the hardware, so it's never exposed to apps or the internet. Gesture-based navigation feels super smooth. It does have a learning curve, but you're gonna learn to love it once you master it. The multitasking gesture is slow and hard to discover. Control center is hard to reach. The speakers are louder. Battery life is totally fine. It's IP67 water resistant. Finally, supports wireless Qi charging. It's Apple's first OLED display, 5.8 inches, designed in collaboration with Samsung. It's got better colors and contrast ratios, supports HDR and Dolby Vision. The screen is 120 Hz touch responsive, but the refresh rate is still 60 Hz. The screen has a slight blue cast at certain angles, but it's really not a big deal. True Tone display is genius, and I never want to go back. Both cameras are stabilized now. The telephoto is faster at f2.4. There's still no headphone jack, and emojis are super cute and fun. It's expensive, there's a notch, and it's pronounced 10, not X. Now that that's out of the way, let's slow down and get into some details. First, some quick housekeeping. If you're new to my channel, I work as a photographer and a video creator. A lot of my work is for web and mobile, a lot of it's for my wife's blog, and so I actually do a lot of professional photography using mobile phones. My daily driver has been an iPhone since the beginning of smartphones, but there's always been so much great Android hardware out there that I can't stick to just one device. So for the testing period, I'm mostly comparing the X to the Google Pixel 2 and also the iPhone 6s, since I think a lot more people will be upgrading from that than from the iPhone 7. Since I promised a review from a photographer's perspective, let's start with the camera. I did a pretty extensive review of the iPhone 8, and most of the key points about it also apply to the 10. It's got the same great lens and sensor on the wide angle, and there's also some improvements to the image signal processor. They've improved the sharpness and contrast of images and decided to slightly boost the saturation, which gives a look that's a little more similar to Samsung phones. Dynamic range, which is the ability to hold detail in both the brightest and darkest parts of the image, is one of the biggest ways that a modern mobile camera can set itself apart, and Apple has steadily improved that over the years. But HDR is one place where the Pixel 2 really has an edge on the iPhone. It keeps more detail and color in the highlights and still manages to look very natural. Just like the iPhone 8, HDR is on by default, but sometimes it doesn't turn on when I want it to, so I would still rather have the manual control. I'm gonna go into a lot more detail about image quality on my podcast, so go to stalmanpodcast.com where I'll have a lot more to say about it. Like previous iPhones, it has a tendency to overexpose just a little bit, so I'm constantly adjusting the exposure down more often than I'd like to. But on the other hand, I find Android phones tend to underexpose, so everyone has some room for improvements in their auto settings. Since we live in Calgary, of course, some of these camera tests need to be out in the mountains. So here's the ski test. It can shoot 60 frames per second in 4K or 240 frames per second in 1080p. The slow motion on this is crazy. None of my other cameras can do this. Even my Sony, which is $3,000, can't do 240 frames per second. And the autofocus does have a lot of trouble at these speeds, but when it works, it looks amazing. Just like on previous iPhones, portrait mode works pretty well when it works, which is not that often, but it looks really great. I think a lot of people love this feature and don't notice the difference. It still doesn't compare to a real SLR, but it's a fun effect, and I'm really glad that it's there. They also added portrait selfie mode, which is a great idea. I find it cuts things out even a little bit worse. If we look at the depth data, we can see that the front camera has a much more detailed understanding of its environment. But somehow that data doesn't really translate into a more realistic image. Ears, hair, glasses, they all get cut off. And the Pixel 2 does a much better job at isolating the same subjects. The new studio lighting features I don't think worked out very well. They have all this extra information to work with, so I expected it to look great, but it's an interesting experiment, but the feature's just not ready yet. iOS 11 adds some new photo filters built into the Photos app that slightly improve on the old ones, but they've basically gone from being truly terrible to meh. But if you want a quick way to give your photos a beautiful look, there is a dead simple app designed for professionals, but anybody can get the hang of it. It's called Filmborn. It's made by Maston Labs, whose Lightroom presets I've been using for years, and it's designed to accurately emulate the experience of shooting film. So you don't spend a lot of time fussing around with a lot of little sliders. You just pick your film stock, tweak your exposure and white balance, and you're done. It's not a fake vintage look, it's not cheesy, just a super simple approach to give your mobile photos a clean and timeless look. So you'll find the link to Filmborn below. The front lines that all these phones are competing on is performance in dark lighting situations. To test the low light on this camera, we're going to shoot some event photography at the opening of the new flagship Canada Goose store here in Calgary. When I did my iPhone 8 review, I didn't really do any head-to-head low light comparisons, but tonight I've got the iPhone 6s. The difference in quality is a lot more obvious when you see it next to this older iPhone. And the performance of speed in this camera in low light just blew away the success. In the time I was able to take 5 photos with the flash on with the older camera, I was able to take 9 photos with the new one. The improvements on the selfie camera were even more impressive than on the front-facing camera. Those tests were in moderately low light, but we also wanted to test it in unacceptably low light. So we flew to Toronto to shoot photos lit by nothing more than Christmas lights. It does a pretty good job, very usable photos, but what's really interesting is when you compare it to the Google Pixel 2. The Pixel has a totally different approach to this low light. It decides to lift the shadows a lot more, which gives you kind of a better thumbnail image, but it also adds a lot of noise to the dark areas, whereas on the iPhone you would lift that exposure in post and you get a little bit less noise. The details in the Pixel are also a lot better, it's sharper, whereas in the iPhone it gets a little smudgy when you zoom into 100%. The iPhone's impressive here, especially if you process it a little bit, it can look really beautiful, but I think out of the box, most people would prefer the Pixel image. So the camera is getting better and better on iPhones, but let's be honest, we're not all excited about this iPhone because of the bump in quality. The phone is designed entirely around the screen, and what a screen it is. You already know that it's OLED, but you may not know why that's so special. The best way to see it is if we turn off all the lights and look at it next to older iPhones, which use LCD displays. The blacks on the 10 are truly black. There is no light coming from it. Meanwhile, the iPhone 7 screen almost looks like a flashlight next to it. That's what I mean when I say the contrast ratio is amazing. The dark and bright parts of the image are more true to life than ever before. As we can all see, Apple wasn't quite able to give us a perfect edge-to-edge screen. We have this black little notch at the top. And when this was announced at the keynote, honestly, I hated it. It's all I could look at. But within a day or two, it becomes a blind spot, and for the most part, I never notice it. And now, not only has it become an extremely powerful piece of branding for Apple, so you can always spot their phones in the lineup of screens, but I've even found myself starting to like the way that it looks. It's that feeling of identifying attachment to an imperfection because you love the main thing so much. The only time that it's really distracting is when you're looking at ultra-wide full-screen content, which is a shame because the screen is extremely wide. A few pioneering YouTubers, including Austin Evans and Jonathan Morrison, even shot their reviews of the iPhone X in ultra-wide formats to take advantage of it. But that turned out to have the unfortunate consequence of always hiding part of the image behind the notch. It kind of breaks the zoom features on YouTube. So the new optimal widescreen format is 2:1, which you're watching right now. This beautiful new screen and Face ID are very closely tied together. Neither would exist without the other. By now you've probably heard that it does generally work pretty great, and I think it'll make for a great future of security on iPhones. But there are a couple of issues. For example, when you're laying down, it's just really surprising how often Face ID fails. Obviously, if your face is smushed in a cushion, it's not going to work, but something about the angle does make it way less reliable for no obvious reason. Also, if you're eating or yawning, a really positive consequence of changing that home interaction to a software swipe instead of a hardware press is that it makes all of the interactions with the phone feel much more organic. Now all the swiping between apps feels part of the same interaction language, so is it worth it? I think as with most expensive products, this is such a broad question to ask that the only honest answer is that it totally depends. It depends how excited you are to have the latest tech. It depends how frustrated you get by learning new tech. For me, someone who pushes my phone to its limits to get my work done, of course it's worth it. But if that doesn't sound like you and you're just looking to get the best tech that you can for a reasonable budget, I have some great news. The iPhone 8 is awesome, and it has most of these same flagship features at a much lower price. Or you can wait till next year, when I'm sure the design of the iPhone 10 will spread across to the rest of Apple devices. We have an embarrassment of riches in both iPhone and Android devices this year, so there's bound to be a phone that's the perfect fit for you. So going into 2018, the iPhone 10 is hands down my favorite phone.